So Thomas has asked me to speak a little bit about the intersection of the rights of Indigenous people and the rights of nature. And I wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor with respect the Indigenous nations on whose traditional territories this university now stands and whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes Indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on settled Indigenous land. We ask the spiritual ancestors to forgive our intrusion and humbly ask for their guidance. So as Chuck said, for the last 5 years, I've been working with Honor the Earth in Minnesota. I myself am not Indigenous, and I'm actually not from Minnesota. I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania, which is just up the road from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But during my time at Honor the Earth, I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Indigenous folks and get to kind of experience some of the worldview that Indigenous folks hold firsthand. So I kind of wanted to start this talk with talking a little bit about origin stories. So for most of us that come from a Western background and that may or may not identify as Christian, but we have to admit that the Christian origin story really has informed and shaped our society. So in that story, we're told that nature was created for us to use as we wish. Now, in Indigenous stories, and again, most of this talk is going to be informed by my experience with the Ojibwe people, or the Anishinaabe, as their traditional name is. So don't at all think that what I'm saying is necessarily universal, but there are a lot of themes in Indigenous thought that kind of cross different cultures. So just as a caveat, in the Anishinaabe origin story, there was already an earth. There was creatures on this planet before the first woman appeared. So that's a completely different kind of way of looking at, was the earth created for man, or was the earth something that we stumbled upon and now we're part of? This origin story and this relationship with nature is also defined by a connection to nature that holds rights and responsibilities. So in Indigenous perspectives, nature is a relative. So, whether it be rocks or fins or fur or hoofed creatures, they are all seen as our relatives. And because they are relatives, we have responsibilities to protect and treat these relatives with respect. When we talk about the rights of Indigenous people, probably the best known document that kind of addresses that is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's a pretty long thing. I was going to talk about all the different articles, but there's like 20 or 30, and I was like, okay, just distill kind of the essence of it. And there's 4 main parts of the Declaration. And that is that there's a right to self-determination, there's a right to cultural identity, there's a right to free, prior, and informed consent, and there's a right to protection from discrimination. So when we talk about the right to cultural identity, something that you have to understand in Indigenous ways of being is that their cultural identity is deeply tied to the land on which they reside. On one aspect, that's a very physical connection. Traditionally, they hunt, fish, and gathered and lived off of the sustenance of that area. But there's also cultural practices and stories that are intimately tied to locations and features on the landscape, which means that part of the cultural identity is tied to the landscape. And without access to those areas and an ability to interact with those areas, you cannot continue those cultural traditions. There's another aspect of this right to cultural identity and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And that has to do with the responsibilities that Indigenous people feel to take care of the land. Not only do they need to have the land to be able to do traditional ceremonies or traditional rituals, part of a lot of beliefs is that there's a responsibility to take care of, your mother or your other relatives. And through the application of Western regulatory practices onto this land, that's really removed that ability for even federally recognized tribal entities to make decisions that impact even their reservation lands. Like, we're not even starting to talk about the ceded territories, even their reservation lands. And so when we start to look at reestablishing, like you said, or acknowledging this inherent right of nature to exist, we also need to acknowledge and respect the connection that Indigenous people have to nature. And we need to kind of take a hard look at our own culture and our own country and realize how we have systematically committed genocide on the Indigenous inhabitants of this planet. Back in the day, it was a very physical genocide, and where we were, on whole scale wiping people out. But there's continued to be this cultural genocide where, it's part assimilation and it's part, removing traditional ways of being. Something else I wanted to touch on, I think I'm getting close to the end of my time, right? No? Okay. Something else that I wanted to touch on was kind of just talk about constitutions and rights and different things like that. So one of the things that a lot of my tribal friends talk about is that in the Constitution it says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so we should all know that the United States holds a number of different treaties with different tribal nations. And to a lot of us, and even myself a few years ago, I saw, these treaties as, so one way to look at the treaties is, a popular way to kind of understand the treaties is that it was the United States government bestowing rights onto these tribal nations, even though these tribal nations existed prior to the formation of the United States government. Well, I attended this talk on treaty rights and responsibilities a while back that was hosted by some groups in Minnesota, and one of the speakers said that really stuck with me is that, these treaties helped the United States gain recognition as a country itself. That since they were able to make treaties with existing nations, that thereby justify the existence of the United States as a nation. And so it's kind of flipping itself on the head that it's not the United States bestowing, being generous and bestowing these rights. It was actually the Indigenous nations that gave our ancestors the rights to live here with them. And look at what we've done since then. Another thing about treaties is, when we talk about treaty rights and the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on reservation and off reservation, it's important to know and think about that in Indigenous perspectives, they have made their own treaties with the rest of creation. So through ceremonies and different activities, they've made agreements with nature on how they're going to hunt, fish, and gather, and what the rules are around the utilization of resources. And so they made these agreements thousands of years ago. And now, when we come in and we start coming in with all these projects that are continuously eroding that resource base, they do not have the ability to go back to these other relatives and renegotiate those treaties. You know, they already know that you're only supposed to take a certain amount of resources so that you can make sure that there's resources left for future generations. It's the seventh generation philosophy that I'm sure most of you have heard about, or some of you have heard about, that basically every decision that's made has to be made for the seventh generation, and making sure that what you do now is setting up their success in the future. For a lot of folks in the indigenous rights movement, there's also the acknowledgement that we are actually living in the seventh generation now. So those ancestors that negotiated those early treaties were 7 generations ago for folks. And so now we are the 7th generation that they thought about. And so we have to think now, what do we want 7 generations from now to think about us?
Yeah, for sure.
So, now looking at how this kind of intersects with the rights of nature. Like I said, in indigenous thought, the earth and the other creatures of creation are relatives, and they're their own entities. You know, I'm sure you've all heard of Mother Earth. You know, that's a concept that comes from indigenous thought, that the earth is our mother and should be treated with the same respect we would give to our human mother. And so at the heart of it, you know, this rights of nature movement is kind of also a philosophical question of, is nature its own entity that deserves respect and rights, acknowledgement of the rights? And if you look at indigenous science, indigenous thought, traditional ecological knowledge, the answer is yes. And so we can look at the rights of nature from a number of different perspectives. I know a lot of us come to it from a community rights perspective and wanting to protect our human communities around us from these damaging practices. Some of us might come from a little bit more of the crunchy granola side and wanting to protect nature for nature's sake. But there's like a third aspect that you can kind of think about, which is the social justice decolonization aspect. And it's like, are we going to actually be real about what our country was built on, and how do we acknowledge that terrible past and move past it to something that 7 generations from now, our descendants are going to be proud of what we did. Should I start with questions, or?
Whatever you want to do. You've got 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes.
Total, or?
Total.
Okay, well then I guess I'll take some questions.